Vladimir Zelensky was there. Let's get Cormac's view on what's going on. Cormac, very good morning to you.
Good morning to you, Mike.
So, Zelensky was at the NATO conference. It was very much dominated by Donald Trump. I mean, there wasn't a lot of talk about Ukraine sort of at the top end of it that I could see, but I'm sure you're going to tell me different.
No, I'm afraid I'm not. There was very little talk about Ukraine, and I don't believe Ukraine was significantly on the agenda. Donald Trump did say that he had a very nice discussion with Volodymyr Zelensky, and he alluded to, having some rough times in the past, but he said some very nice things. But clearly this NATO conference was all about Donald Trump.
Yeah.
It was all about what's going on in the Middle East between Israel and Iran, despite the fact NATO is not involved in that. And it was all about, quite frankly, some of the most amusing sycophancy from Mark Rutte in particular that I have ever heard, and praise of Donald Trump. But I think being realistic, that this NATO summit was about doing everything that NATO members could to keep the US engaged in the European theatre for as long as we can.
Yes. Well, it seems as though much of that involves buying a lot of weapons and aircraft and whatever else from the US. I think that the whole business of trade deals has been wrapped up in all of that as well, because Keir Starmer's today at the British Chamber of Commerce talking about how, they've done this great trade deal with the US. Well, the first thing that they've done is buy or promise to buy, about £1 billion worth of aircraft from America, which is hardly going to boost British economy. It's hardly going to boost, British jobs, but, it may well be necessary. But I'm sure that's part of the deal.
Well, a comment on that. What they purchased, or what they have promised to purchase, is 12 F-35s, which, of course, are one of America's most effective fighters. But I'd remind viewers that it was about 3 or 4 months ago, I was out walking my dog and listening to the news when I do, as I do. And Donald Trump was making an announcement, and he was saying, we produce the biggest, most lethal, best weapons in the history of the world, and we will sell them to our allies. But when we do, we will downgrade them by 10%, because our allies may not always be our allies. And there have been several other countries raising concerns around the F-35 in particular, and what control the US would maintain over the use of those. So I think there is reason for concern there in the purchase of F-35s.
And I mean, as far as Ukraine being back on the table, if you like, I mean, he said, I think, Donald Trump, that, Vladimir Putin's turned out to be a bit more difficult of a customer than he thought he was. This morning we've got a piece in The Sun talking about how Putin has been very active in undermining the west of Europe, effectively, by continuing to aid and abet smuggling gangs, providing fake documents, transport, even military escorts in some cases, to kind of flood Western Europe with migrants from the various different parts of the world from where they're coming.
Well, look, Mike, I think that's very, very credible. It wouldn't be the first time that Vladimir Putin has sought to weaponize immigration and refugees. The first big example we saw of this was back in Syria in 2015, I believe. I've been studying Russian hybrid warfare since 2016. It's also referred to as grey zone warfare. Yeah. I think it's fair of me to say it's only in the last year or so that we're starting to hear a lot more, if you like, big characters, former diplomats and former intelligence and military men talking about grey zone warfare. Our public are simply not sufficiently aware of what it entails and all the different ways that Russia, Iran also, but Russia will use this to damage and destabilize our societies. Of course, we saw what happened in Salisbury back in 2018. But one of the things I learned very early on about Russia is they're probably not as smart or as strategic as I originally thought, but they are opportunistic. So while I would not say that we could lay the blame for our small boats crisis, or whatever one wants to call it, on Vladimir Putin. He is certainly opportunistic, and if he sees an opportunity to stick his oar in and exacerbate the situation, then he will certainly do that, knowing that it is not only costing us money in the United Kingdom, but it is increasingly costing huge divisions and problems within our society. And this is what Putin always wants to do. He wants to weaken us and he wants to sow discord in our societies. So, yes, I'd say it's very credible that he's seen an opportunity to, as I said, stick their oar in, if you'll excuse the pun, to stick their oar into this and exacerbate the situation and make it even worse.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. Cormac Smith, good to talk to you, former Ukraine Foreign Ministerial Advisor. We were playing some of